Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is the last of the talks in this series, and we're going to talk about now. We really can't look at our own time with a lot of objectivity, like a historian will be able to even 100 years from now. We can't see the long picture, the big picture of the trend that we're in the middle of. All we can really do is understand where we came from and look at now and maybe try to make some predictions about where we're headed. And that's what we'll attempt to do in this talk. In the history of Christianity in the United States, we could call this the first 2 decades of the 21st century, shifting grounds. And again, here's the schedule that we've been keeping. This is our last class, last talk. Before we look at the United States, I just want to pan out at the state of global Christianity. And in the past approximately 50 years, the demographics have shifted dramatically. Far more Christians now are in the global South, meaning Africa, Asia, South America, than in the global North, Canada, the United States, Europe, etc. You can see the shift that's happened in these years. Worldwide, in 2018, there were 2.5 billion Christians, which was the equivalent of 33% of the global population. And you can see here that 2018 marked the year that Africa had the most Christians of any continent in the world. And as far as the distribution of Christians across the different traditions, 49% were Catholic, are Catholic, and 22% Protestant. Speaking about just the Protestant tradition, this graph shows us the growth in Protestantism over the 500 years since Luther and the Protestant Reformation. You can see the growth, and you can see how in all of these continents, Christianity is sort of leveled off, except for Asia, which is still going up, and Africa, which is going up dramatically. The percentage of Protestants, or the number of Protestants in Africa, has taken off since the 1950s. And this table shows you the countries with the fastest growing Protestant population, and using the same color coding, you can see that all except for Honduras, all of these fastest growing Protestant populations are in countries in Africa or in Asia. So it's a very different global landscape in a relatively short amount of time. And despite the fact that Europe was the birthplace of Protestantism, it is expected that by 2050, less than 10% of Protestants will live in Europe. And by that same year, it's expected that 53% of all Protestants will live in Africa. Okay. Before I go on to the 21st century, just a rapid fire review of our Christian history that I've covered in these talks, our history in a tidy nutshell. So the colonial beginnings, the 1600s, and I'm just going to use phrases and words to kind of jog your memory. So in the 1600s, the doctrine of discovery, Puritans and Anglicans out of the Protestant Reform, a vision of society as composed of well-ordered families established by marriage. We have the concept of the city on a hill, the Anglo-Saxon myth, and the first slaves. The period of Americanization in the 1700s. We see the first Great Awakening and the beginning of Evangelicalism in the colonies. We see a movement towards democratization, the Revolutionary War and the church's role in that, the definite establishment of chattel slavery, the hush harbors of the invisible institution of the Black church, and we see early movements of abolitionism. The 1800s, which has been called the Protestant century, we see early in the century, the Second Great Awakening. We see a lot of religious energies being fueling all kinds of social reforms and movements. We see new religious movements like Mormonism and Seventh-day Adventist and Christian Science and the Shakers, all of those happen in this century and more. We see this intense missionary vision and zeal for bringing the gospel around the world. And we see a second wave of very, very fervent abolitionism. We see the Civil War, the attempt at Reconstruction, and the collapse of that, and the white, quote unquote, redemption in the South. And we see segregation being legalized. And then we get to the 20th century, where there's challenges to Christianity. And we have the modernist versus fundamentalist controversy. We see evangelicalism splitting into liberals, fundamentalists, and people who are a group called the Evangelicals. So three different takes. We see a growing alignment of evangelicalism and fundamentalism, and all of them aligning with political power. We see the KKK, lynching, Jim Crow. We see the Great Migration of a huge population of Black people from the rural South to the urban North. We see the white flight of people, white people moving out to the suburbs and leaving the cities at this point. And we see the civil rights movement. So that gets us to today, the first couple of decades of this century, and people are writing about their observations on what's happening in the church in the United States, in particular evangelicalism. There's a lot out there, and I just chose these three particular things to focus my talk tonight, but it could have been three other different things. But what I chose was, first of all, this article from Christianity Today from April of this year, The Splintering of the Evangelical Soul. Another article on the website Mere Orthodoxy called The Six-Way Fracturing of Evangelicalism, and this was just from June 7th, very new. And then this book that was just published this year called The Nuns, Where They Came From, Who They Are, and Where They're Going by Ryan P. Burge, who's an American Baptist pastor and also an academic. And he studies data related to religion and politics. So from my first source, the book, The Nuns, there are a lot of tables and graphs in this book. So he studies data, but I picked up two of them. This one shows over the period 72 to 2018, the movement of various religious traditions in the United States. The Black Protestants, Jewish, and other faiths sort of remaining fairly stable down here. We see a tremendous decline in numbers of mainline churches like Methodists and Episcopalians, that sort of thing. We see some decline in the Catholic and Evangelical traditions, the two largest traditions. And what is of greatest interest here is we see the precipitous rise of a group of people who have no religion. And in 2018, for the first time, that group of people, their number exceeded the number of Catholics or evangelicals. In this chart, he shows the difference between, he uses two different data sources. So in the GSS data source, they combine all the different types of people who say they have no religion, all the nuns. And then the other data source, the CCES, that data source splits it out between the atheists, the agnostic, and those who say they have nothing, they're nothing in particular. And you can see that there are a far more of the nothing in particulars than there are people who identify as atheist or agnostic. And Burge in his book goes on to try to explain why this religious disaffiliation is happening. And he makes the point, the valid point, that every disaffiliated person has his or her own story. But there's no segment of American society that has been immune to this rise of religious disaffiliation. When he looked at it across age, education, gender, or race, he saw this disaffiliation happening everywhere. Based on his data, he gives a brief description of the three groupings of the nuns. The atheists, he says, are some of the most educated with above average incomes. It's a male-dominated cohort. They're liberals. They often vote Democratic. They're very politically active and incredibly unlikely to become Christian, because he looks at data over time as well. Agnostics, there's a somewhat more restrained version of the atheists, but very few of them are open to the Christian message as well. The nothing in particulars, that large group, have very little in common with atheists and agnostics. And here it's not male dominated, it's equal across genders. They tend to be of a lower level of education and lower income levels, socially and politically isolated. And interestingly, about 1 in 6 of them becomes affiliated with the Christian tradition over a 4-year period. And this group, this nothing in particular, he describes as the fastest growing, quote unquote, religious group in the United States today. And we saw that on the first graph. So just some data. The Christianity Today article, The Splintering of the Evangelical Soul, they observed that fractures are happening in the American evangelical movement. Couples, families, friends, congregations that were once united in their commitment to Christ, they're now dividing over seemingly irreconcilable views of the world. And they're not merely dividing, but they're becoming incomprehensible to each other. And this Christianity Today article, they talk about one of the sources of this splintering, as they call it, has to do with a crisis in 3 different sources of where Christians get their information, where evangelicals get their information. And there's a crisis in these. And the article goes on to explain this a little bit, which I would like to do as well. So in terms of the media, the article says that the media today has grown more powerful and pervasive. It's more fragmented and polarizing, more angry and hyperbolic. And it's become increasingly effective, media, at dividing people into these hermetic spheres where they deliver and you can get the information and the commentary and that confirms your own anxieties and hates, which presents an enormous challenge for Christian discipleship because media consumption has been climbing for years, and it soared during the pandemic. And members of congregations may spend a few hours a week reading the Bible, but they mainline the animosities of the day for 40 hours a week or more from social media and news media. And Christian communities that once shared a broader view of the world find that they only agree at this point on the bare essentials of the faith. And the longer we live in separate media worlds, the deeper and broader our divisions will become. The other crisis that they talk about is the crisis of evangelical leadership, or our authority crisis. And this is our own making, basically. We have seen some evangelical leaders fall from grace in some spectacularly destructive ways. And we've also seen the rise of the celebrity pastor and the celebrity pastor looking for a dashing profile and self-promotion and wealth and stardom in a Christian celebrity culture. And this causes disillusionment and division in amongst the people that are following these leaders. And then the third crisis they addressed was community. They remind us that community is essential to Christian life. It's where we deepen our knowledge of the word and forge these shared identities in Christ and cultivate our Christian character and disciple our young and all of these important values of community. But the pressures and the temptations and the growing distractions of contemporary life have strained Christian community. And also the pandemic just even deepened that. And many people are looking to other tribes online to have a sense of belonging, like political tribes or conspiracy theory communities. And there's hyper politicization of the American evangelical movement has led to some political sorting. So if you're in a congregation where you don't like your pastor's political stance, you can go find another church where you do agree with their political stance, where they're the same politics as yours. And so there's sorting and dividing happening. And one sociologist and scholar of American religion who has studied religious congregations for 30 years in America, and he says he's never seen such an extraordinary level of conflict. I wanted to take a look at that third article, the 6-way fracturing of evangelicalism, and they talk about basically the same roots as the Christianity Today article, but they take a stab at describing the categories that are being created as evangelicalism is splintering now. Just briefly to describe these. One, the neo-fundamentalist evangelical. These are very conservative evangelicals who are very concerned about political and theological liberalism and worried about the church's drift towards liberalism. And they're very concerned about the culture's increasing hostility to Christianity, especially the government and media. 2, we have the mainstream evangelical. They are focused, their emphasis is on the fulfillment of the Great Commission. They do share some of the concerns of the number of the first group in terms of secular influences in the church and liberalism, not as stridently. They still share some of those concerns. They're less likely to be comfortable with the rhetoric Trump and other conservatives use, but they view this direction as the lesser of two evils. The neo-evangelicals, number 3 here, they see themselves as global evangelicals, and they're doctrinally evangelical, but they no longer so much use the term evangelical in some circumstances in the American context, because the term has become more political than theological. They're concerned, the 3s are concerned by conservative Christianity's acceptance of Trump and the failure for the church to engage on topics of race and sexuality in helpful ways. Then we have the post-evangelical. These are people who fully left evangelicalism, and they reject the evangelical label, but they're still church. They're likely still, agreeing with the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, but they're much more vocal in their criticism of the ones and the twos. Some of them remain in Protestant circles, others are evangelical circles, even though they don't call themselves evangelical. Others have crossed over into mainline churches, into Catholic or even Orthodox traditions, while holding on to the basic creeds. Their big concern is threats within the church. They're focused on abuse and corruption, hypocrisy, Christian nationalism, and the secular right. And outside the church, they're primarily concerned with matters of injustice, inequality, and the secular right, and to a lesser extent, the radical secular left. Okay. And then we have the de-churched with some Jesus. These people have left the church, but they still hold on to Orthodox Christian beliefs, or at least some. And then the de-churched and the deconverted, they've left the church and they've completely deconverted with no remaining Christian beliefs. And over the last 5 decades, according to this article, these groups, These division and these groups have been becoming increasingly more clear. For some of them, the decades-old exhaustion with the culture wars has disenfranchised them. For some, 5 or 6 years of dissonance with how fellow congregants process Trump, Mike Brown and Trayvon Martin created separation. Finally, for others, the separation wasn't palpable until 2021, when divergence was revealed again as to how people processed COVID, masks, the losses of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, etc., Trump's re-election campaign and January 6th. So different ways of processing, seeing other Christians process differently than you do is causing these fractures. And one of the things that the article authors said was, and they've talked with pastors about this, and they've learned that pretty much ones and fours have opted out of worshiping together in the same church. They are so completely divided on everything except the bare minimum of Christianity. The implications for the future of evangelicalism, particularly the church, what this article is, and this is just trying to predict where we're going if nothing changes. So they're saying that this fracturing, they've asked pastors, how elastic can a church be? How many of those, not the bottom two, but of the first, the 1 through 4s, how many of those can one church accommodate when they have such different views and such different ways of processing? And the answer that they're getting from pastors is 2 adjacent groupings. Let me go back to that. So, for example, the 1s and 2s could worship in the same church, be community together. The 3s and 4s together, but not the 1s and 3s, and not the 1s and 4s, and not the 2s and 4s. And so they're saying if this continues, then we'll end up with 3 different types of churches. So we'll have a type A church that continues to carry on the culture wars and seeing the primary mode of cultural engagement through political activism through the Republican Party. The type B church is going to have a course that's not quite as culture war centric. They're going to still be politically involved, but their primary mode of cultural engagement will be interpersonal. They'll seek to make disciples and be neighborly. The type C church will seek to recover the public witness of the church by critiquing abuse, hypocrisy, inconsistencies, and misconduct. And their primary mode will be calling the church to ethical fidelity, justice, and empathy towards the lost, marginalized, oppressed, or disinherited. One of the books that has helped me a lot in this study is The Color of Compromise: The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism by Jamar Tisby. And he's a Black Christian historian. And one of the things that he writes about in this book is the white evangelical cultural toolkit. So how do white evangelicals organize and evaluate and process things? And we're moving to this because I'd just like to spend a couple minutes through the lens of race in this time of Black Lives Matter. So he says that the toolkit that white evangelicals use is made up of these 3 things primarily. One is accountable individualism, which means that individuals exist independent of structures and institutions. They have free will and independently are accountable for their own actions. And this belief promotes a skepticism toward the idea that social systems and structures profoundly shape the actions of individuals. So it discounts structures and systems. Another belief in the cultural toolkit is relationalism, with an emphasis on interpersonal relationships. And according to relationalism, social problems are fundamentally due to broken personal relationships. And so they focus their processing and their solutions there. And then all of this comes with an anti-structuralism, which I've mentioned, That if you put a focus on structures and systems, you are taking the focus on individual accountability. And he says in his book that white evangelicals need to add to their cultural toolkit. They need to expand it and think more broadly that systems and structures do affect the decisions that people make, individual actions, and do affect relationships. It all comes to, it's all part of a big complex picture that needs to be addressed together. A word or two about Black Lives Matter. So Black Lives Matter, you may remember, started just as a social media post in 2013 in response to when George Zimmerman was acquitted of wrongdoing in the shooting death of an unarmed Black teenager, Trayvon Martin. And in its second iteration happened in 2020 with the death of George Floyd. And it became a rallying cry in protests and also in basically an assertion of the image of God in Black people. And Jemar Tisby, in his writing, his book, he's a Black person. So I'm listening to how he's feeling about this. And he says that the phrase Black Lives Matter resonated at a deep level with Black people. Black people who sensed those words addressing a deep and painful longing, this longing to have others recognize their fully unqualified humanity. And he says, sadly, many white Christians didn't realize this. They didn't understand this resonance that this had for all Black people to hear Black Lives Matter. And they responded with opposition. And that was hurtful. Now, the BLM exists as both an organization with, staff and budget and et cetera. It also exists as a movement. And the organization doesn't identify in any way as being faith-based, unlike the Southern Christian Leadership Conference under Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. That definitely identified as faith-based. Black Lives Matter organization doesn't. But the American Evangelical Church hasn't come up with any other movement to as viable and potent to address this necessary concept that Black lives do indeed matter. Instead of coming up with a movement or an organization to help, they've just responded in fear and antagonism. Although not all, here's a white clergyman here at some sort of rally standing in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. But you can see here's one thing I got off the web: 3 reasons Christians should not support Black Lives Matter. That was an article. And here's another one. Another one that I found that was very interesting, because it's making that connection between just racial justice issues and communism. Here calling it Marxism, sometimes socialism, which we've seen all the way back to the beginning of the century, when the Ku Klux Klan had that sign that I showed you that had the Ku Klux Klan fighting integration and communism. So that ongoing connection of racial justice issues with this tremendous fear that we have in the United States of communism, and amongst many white Americans, communism and Marxism. So Jemar Tisby has another book called How to Fight Racism, and in it he identifies 3 dimensions of fighting for racial justice. He calls it the ARC, A-R-C, of justice, and he says that the A is for awareness, so increasing awareness of the issues, like learning racial history, which has been one of the goals of this series of talks that I'm doing. So raising your awareness. R is for relationships, building relationships across ethnic and color boundaries. And then commitment, a commitment to concrete action, and making anti-racist activity as a way of life, not just something you talk about now and then. He says, developing awareness and relationships may create in you a burden for the struggles of others, but he asks, does that move you to act, to commit? And that book, the How to Fight Racism by Jamar Tisby, is chock full of practical ideas and suggestions on all three of these categories. So I just want to end this last talk with just a few words of encouragement and inspiration, hopefully, and hope from things that I've come across and read and thought about since I've started on this journey. So this is a book, Becoming Brave, Finding the Courage to Pursue Justice, Racial Justice Now, published in 2020 by Brenda Salter McNeil, who's a Black evangelical professor, minister. And she writes this book through the lens of Esther, the story of Esther in the Bible. Esther, the Jewish woman who was made queen of Persia while the Jews were still in exile. And there's a plot to exterminate the Jews, which Esther's uncle finds out about, and he goes to ask Esther to intervene with the king, her husband. And she's afraid of him. You can't just go walk into his presence. And he says to her, who knows, perhaps you have come to royalty for just such a time as this. And this is one of the quotes from this book that has inspired me. And it's true of all of us. You are on this earth in this moment, in your community, to be a voice, a beacon, a light for such a time as this. Over the last century, and especially since the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s, there has been a tendency towards the politicization of nearly everything. And each and every faction in society seeks the patronage of political power as a means of imposing its particular understanding of the good on the whole of society. And taken to an extreme, our identity becomes so tightly linked with our partisan position, left or right. And this commitment becomes a measure of a person's moral significance, whether a person is judged good or bad. And this is the face of identity politics. And in aligning with political power, both sides show their intent and desire to dominate and control. And they both ground their story in a strong belief of being wrong and injured by the other. And I have to say that it seems to me that in conformity to the spirit of the modern age, Christians conceive of power as political power. Not all, many Christians. It's been the trend over the century, the 20th century. What if there's another way for followers of Jesus, a way we've forgotten that we used to be? Being a faithful presence, offering something different from the spirit of this age. People who come together in an environment, the church, that embodies continuity, historical memory, rituals marking the seasons of life, intergenerational interdependence, common worship. And then going out of the church community, going out into the world with the recognition that we share this world with others and that we must contribute to its overall flourishing and leave behind the fear, the anger, the judgment, the hate, the will to power, the being selective in who we choose to love, who we will love, being selective in who we will love. This is something off Twitter that I grabbed last week from a young scholar. She says, I know that everything awful in the world and in the church is exhausting and overwhelming. You can't always change the institution. You can't always change the tide, but you can lay down your life for the vulnerable and marginalized. You can always do that. Here I have a couple of quotes from a woman named Valerie Kaur, who's a civil rights leader and founder of the Revolutionary Love Project. And she's not a Christian, But she was at an online conference this summer, a conference of Christian leaders, and she was a keynote speaker speaking to a group of Christian leaders. And she said to them, "This is what your scriptures teach. You, of all people, should know that it's about love." And a couple of quotes from her. "America is in transition. Sound government is necessary, but it's not enough to create a society where we will all be free, where we are all free. This work belongs to us, the people." And also, "The future is dark. Is it the darkness of the tomb or the darkness of the womb? Is our nation dead or still waiting to be born? We choose to believe that our nation is in transition. We are in labor. Labor requires pain and love. Revolutionary love is the call of our times." She wrote a book also published in 2020 called "See No Stranger," and she has developed materials for using and teaching her work, free materials online. And it really is, even though she's not a Christian, has this understanding of the call of Jesus to love ourselves, to love others, and to love our opponents or our enemies. And her work really helps flesh out how to actually do that. I mean, we are called to love others and to love our enemies, but sometimes we don't know how to do that. And I appreciate her work for some very concrete guidance. Perhaps one of the biblical teachings we need to revive, to teach more and focus on is the image of God, the imago Dei, translated the image of God, that all humans are created in the image of God. It's the very first thing said about human beings on the first page of the Bible. All humans, smooth-skinned babies and wrinkled, aged people, everyone with any shade of color. If you're a man, a woman, if you're struggling with your gender, the straight, the gay, the transgender, the Republican, the Democrat, the Trump supporter, the Biden supporter, and I could go on and on. Every single human being made in the image of God, whether we like that person or not. This truth, this biblical truth, cuts across it all. And every human being created in the image of and likeness of God makes every person on earth deserving of love. It sounds so simple, but it can have a profound effect on how we think and how we act if we were to focus on this biblical truth. At the end of it all, there's no easy answer. Let's not be consumed with nostalgia for a bygone era. Let's move forward, meet the needs around us, be a church that makes hurting lives better, not a church that makes people feel worse. In the parable in Matthew of the sower, he planted seeds, and some of it fell on inhospitable ground and never took root. And some managed to find hospitable soil, fertile soil, and it takes root and creates a bountiful harvest. Maybe the church needs to stop trying to control where the seed lands. The winds of secularization and polarization are blowing like never before, and most of the seed that we sow is going to fall on rocky ground and never reap a harvest. And there are fewer and fewer people every year to sow. It's easy to give up hope. Remember the words of Paul to the church in Galatia? He said, "So let us not grow weary in doing what is right, for we will reap at harvest time if we do not give up." Seeds that express the love and grace and hope of Jesus Christ is never truly lost. Feeling hopeless, just keep throwing out seed. And I pray God's blessing on each of you who have watched these talks, been in the class where I taught them live. Pray God's blessing on each of you as you go forth sowing seeds of racial justice and of love. And I'd just like to, before I sign off on this talk, I'd just like to let you know that in the fall, I am going to be doing a virtual pilgrimage on Zoom back to just before Christmas in 1846 in Boston at Faneuil Hall for the National Anti-Slavery Bazaar. Take a look at what's for sale to eat there, what kinds of things they're selling to raise money for the anti-slavery cause. And most importantly, give you a chance to, in a imaginary way, to mingle with the men and women, white, black, freeborn, ex-slave, all of them who fueled this enormous spiritual bonfire of abolitionism in the first half of the 1800s. So look for information about that coming in August, and that will be something happening in the fall. And thank you for listening in. Thank you for taking the time to make yourself more aware of our Christian history and including through the lens of race. Thank you very much, and hope to see you and talk to you again sometime in the future. Bye for now.